So I went to see the Odyssey. In spite of the countless dislikes on the movie's trailers, in spite of some of the questionable casting choices, in spite of the almost complete lack of Greek representation in an adaptation of one of the most famous Greek myths ever written, and in spite of the multiple videos made by me criticizing the decisions the filmmakers had already revealed. But despite all of those things, I was never going to simply let the movie pass me by. I'm perfectly willing to make judgments based on the information available to me, but I'm also not going to draw a line in the sand and completely make up my mind about a movie I haven't even seen yet. And now that I have seen it, I have to be honest. It was actually pretty entertaining. Does it mean I liked everything? No. Some of the things I thought would bother me did bother me, a lot. Others ended up being nowhere near as bad as I expected, and a few parts of the movie were genuinely excellent. So today, I'm going to run through all of it. The things I liked, the things I didn't like, the changes from Homer that worked, the changes that absolutely didn't, and where I ultimately land on Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. Now, I've spent the last few months making videos criticizing the movie. I questioned the casting, the lack of Greek representation, the bizarre armor, the modern dialogue, the inclusion of characters who weren't even in Homer's poem, and whether Nolan was adapting the Odyssey or simply using it as a foundation for his own version of the entire Trojan War. And just to make this extremely clear from the beginning, this video will contain spoilers. I've already released a separate video looking at Cersei that avoided spoiling the rest of the movie, but today I want to discuss the film properly, which means talking about the monsters, the performances, the changes from Homer, and the way Nolan ultimately chose to end the story. So if you haven't seen the movie yet and you want to go into it completely blind, now would probably be a good time to leave. Just be sure to come back when you've seen it. Starting with my overall reaction. I think this may be genuinely one of Christopher Nolan's better films. Now, I'm not someone who automatically believes every Nolan movie is a masterpiece simply because his name is attached to it, and based on the trailers, I had quite a few concerns going in. But the movie worked for me far more than I expected it to. It runs for just under 3 hours, 2 hours and 52 minutes to be exact, but I was engaged for almost the entire thing. It moves surprisingly quickly, especially considering how much material Nolan is attempting to cover. And while certain sequences could have used more time, I never really had that feeling of waiting for the movie to get on with it. The pacing was strong, the story continued moving, and even when it slowed down, it usually felt as though it was building towards something rather than simply filling time. And perhaps most shockingly of all, this was a Christopher Nolan movie where I could actually hear what people were saying. A groundbreaking achievement. Some of the visual effects were the biggest strengths of the entire movie, and the Cyclops was easily one of the biggest highlights for me. Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant son of Poseidon and Theusa in Greek mythology, was both terrifying and extremely well done. The film did an excellent job of communicating the scale difference between the Cyclops and Odysseus' men without making the creature feel like a weightless digital effect. The cave sequence was dark, claustrophobic, and properly unpleasant. That said, even the Cyclops sequence makes some fairly significant changes from Homer. In the poem, Polyphemus is not simply a silent monster that Odysseus has to escape. He speaks extensively, questions the men, mocks the authority of Zeus, eats several members of the crew, and becomes part of one of Odysseus' most famous tricks. Odysseus tells him that his name is Nobody, so when the other Cyclopes hear Polyphemus screaming and ask who is attacking him, he answers that nobody is killing him, causing them to leave him alone. Nolan removes most of that verbal exchange, including the nobody trick, which means the scene loses one of the clearest demonstrations of Odysseus winning through language and deception rather than force. Homer's Polyphemus also prays directly to his father Poseidon after Odysseus reveals his true name, setting the divine persecution that follows into motion. Would I have preferred to see the nobody sequence? Absolutely. It's arguably the defining moment of the Cyclops episode. But the version we received was still so visually effective that I found myself enjoying it despite the change. This is sort of a recurring theme throughout the movie. Nolan frequently moves away from Homer, sometimes very far away from Homer, but several of those changes work surprisingly well on their own cinematic terms. Cersei is probably the best example. I've already made a dedicated video on her, so I won't repeat the entire story here. But candidly, Cersei's section may have been my favourite part of the whole film. Samantha Morton was excellent. The atmosphere of her island felt strange and deeply unsettling, and the transformation of Odysseus' men into pigs was handled as full-blown body horror. Rather than having the men disappear in a burst of magic and immediately replacing them with animals, Nolan forces us to watch their faces and bodies twist into something inhuman. It was grotesque, uncomfortable, and much darker than I expected. But it is also very different from Homer. In the poem, Hermes intercepts Odysseus and gives him the magical herb moly, which protects him from Cersei's spell. Odysseus then confronts her, makes her swear an oath, becomes her lover, and remains on her island with his men for an entire year before continuing the journey. In Nolan's film, Hermes and the moly are removed completely. Odysseus instead figures out what Cersei is doing himself and threatens the crow presented as her transformed sister, forcing Cersei to restore the men. That sister doesn't appear as a crow in Homer. Cersei doesn't attempt to seduce Odysseus, and the year-long stay is reduced to one short confrontation. So is Nolan's Cersei especially faithful? Not really. But did the sequence work? In my opinion, yes. And I think there is an important distinction between changing something because you may have misunderstood it, and changing something because you have a clear alternative idea that works within the film. Nolan transforms Cersei from a seductive goddess who becomes Odysseus' lover and host into a much more threatening figure who views the men entering her home as violent, gluttonous intruders. I don't really prefer that interpretation to Homer's, but I thought the execution of the direction they did go was excellent. Matt Damon was also better as Odysseus than I expected. I was one of the people who looked at the original casting and thought, that's Jason Bourne wearing ancient Greek armor. And to be completely honest, there were still moments where I remained aware that I was watching Matt Damon. He is simply too famous for that association to disappear entirely, but he did manage to convey the exhaustion of a man who has been at war for 10 years and then spends years being battered around the Mediterranean, losing almost everyone who followed him. Nolan's Odysseus is not exactly Homer's Odysseus. The poem repeatedly defines him through cunning, adaptability, deception, storytelling, and the word polytropos, the man of many turns. Damon's version is more practical, physically capable, and visibly traumatized. The film places much more emphasis on guilt and the psychological consequences of war, while reducing some of Odysseus' humor, arrogance, and delight in his own intelligence. He's also given far less direct divine assistance because most of the gods have either been removed or transformed into something more ambiguous. Tom Holland was also alright as Telemachus. Again, the celebrity problem never disappeared completely. I was always at least slightly aware that Spider-Man was waiting for Jason Bourne to return from Troy, but Holland gave the character more weight than the trailers suggested. Telemachus is supposed to begin the story uncertain, frustrated, and trapped beneath the reputation of a father he barely remembers, before gradually becoming capable of standing beside Odysseus. Holland handled that progression reasonably well. Robert Pattinson was pretty good too. His Antinous was unpleasant, manipulative, entitled, and just charming enough that you could understand how he maintained influence over the other suitors. Overall, while the film does leave out quite a lot of the Odyssey, I was still surprised by how many of the major episodes it managed to cover. We get Troy, the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, Cersei, the Underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, Calypso, Telemachus, Penelope, Antinous, the return in disguise, and the confrontation with the suitors. Entire sections still disappear, including Aeolus and his bag of winds, the Phaeacians and Nausicaa, several important appearances by the gods, Laertes, and the number of spirits Odysseus encounters in the underworld. But for a film under 3 hours, it covers a lot. The Laestrygonians were somewhere in the middle for me. Visually, they were cool, but they were almost nothing like the Laestrygonians in Homer. In the poem, Odysseus reaches a city populated by enormous cannibals. Their king, Antiphates, immediately seizes and eats one of the Greek scouts, after which the rest of the Laestrygonians attack the fleet, hurl massive rocks down onto their ships, spear the men like fish, and carry their bodies away to eat them. So again, did they look cool? Yes. But were they the Laestrygonians from Homer? Barely. I can accept creative liberties, particularly when mythology has never had one perfectly fixed visual canon, but this was one of the points where I thought Nolan went a little too far. You could rename those characters and place them in almost any fantasy movie without changing much. I had a somewhat similar reaction to the sirens. I didn't dislike the scene, and it had a strange, dreamlike atmosphere, but I wish Nolan had done more with them. The sequence felt as though it arrived, created an interesting image, and then ended before it could become one of the major set pieces. Sinon was another choice I'd criticized before release, because Sinon is simply not a character in the Odyssey. The detailed version of his deception comes primarily from Virgil's Aeneid, where he manipulates the Trojans into believing that the wooden horse is a sacred offering. So right from the beginning, Nolan is already stepping inside Homer and pulling material from the Iliad, the Aeneid, Greek tragedy, and the wider Trojan War tradition. And I still think that's a strange decision. The film was marketed as an adaptation of Homer's Odyssey, yet one of the first characters we meet has effectively been imported from a completely different epic written by a Roman poet centuries later. That said, Sinon is not in the film for very long. The sequence establishes the fall of Troy, gives context to Odysseus' guilt, and doesn't consume enough screen time to seriously derail the movie. So while I still think Sinon's inclusion is historically and narratively messy and emblematic of the film's rather loose attitude towards its source material, it ultimately wasn't substantial enough to damage the film. Helen of Troy also felt slightly off to me, and I still don't think Lupita Nyong'o was the right casting choice for the character. Helen is one of the most famous and symbolically loaded women in mythology, and while Homer doesn't provide a modern police sketch description of her face, she still carries thousands of years of Greek and European artistic associations. I never completely believed that I was watching Helen of Troy, but in the finished film, she has so little screen time that it simply isn't a major problem. Based on the trailers and casting announcements, I expected Helen to occupy a much larger section of the story. She doesn't, so while the choice still didn't work for me, it didn't damage the movie in the way I thought it might. But unfortunately, I can't say the same about Athena. Zendaya as Athena was easily my least favorite piece of casting in the film, and this is not because I think Zendaya is incapable of acting. I just never felt that she adequately embodied Athena, the goddess of wisdom, strategy, disciplined warfare, and divine intelligence. Athena should have a commanding presence. She should feel as though she understands what everyone in the room is going to do before they do it. Her support of Odysseus is not simply emotional encouragement. She is the divine reflection of the qualities that make him exceptional. And Zendaya never gave me that feeling. She felt too young, too contemporary, and too restrained. To be fair, Nolan has also radically changed the role of the gods. In the film, most of the gods never physically appear, and Athena is presented in a much more ambiguous and psychological way, almost as a manifestation of memory, guilt, or judgment, rather than the active Olympian strategist Homer describes. I understand Nolan's decision. He wanted a more grounded story about war, trauma, memory, and responsibility, but removing the gods from the Odyssey is not a small adjustment, and it's just not something that I fundamentally agree with when gods are so integral to the story. That brings me to the wider casting, which remains my biggest overall criticism. Although some of these actors did a great job, I still believe the ensemble was assembled too heavily around prestige and modern Hollywood casting priorities rather than building the most convincing Greek world possible. In particular, the lack of meaningful Greek representation remains surprising to me. This is one of the largest adaptations of the most famous Greek epic ever produced, with a huge budget and an enormous international search for locations, craftspeople, and performers. And yet Greek actors appear to have been treated as almost completely unnecessary to the major cast. I never argued that every character needed to be played by a Greek actor, but creating meaningful space for Greek performers would have helped the world feel less like a collection of celebrities visiting Greek mythology for the summer. And I still can't completely shake the impression that certain decisions were made for reasons other than who most naturally embodied the character. Whether that came from socio-political considerations, commercial calculations, Nolan's desire to work with specific actors, or some combination of all three. To be clear here, I am still giving this film a strong score, despite disagreeing with many of the casting decisions. And honestly, with a cast that felt completely native to this world, it could have been even higher. Great performances and perfect casting aren't necessarily the same thing. Matt Damon performed well as Nolan's Odysseus, but I can still imagine an actor who felt more naturally like the king of Ithaca. The ending is another area where I was fairly neutral, because Nolan changes it substantially. On one hand, it produces a cleaner and more emotionally redemptive conclusion for a modern audience. On the other, it removes some of the strange and deeply uncomfortable morality that makes Homer's ending so fascinating. Odysseus' return in the poem isn't just a happy reunion. It involves massacre, execution, mutilation, purification, and the threat of civil war. Nolan turns that into something more focused on relinquishing power, accepting responsibility, and moving forward. And I think that is ultimately where I land on the entire movie. It is not a completely faithful adaptation of the Odyssey. It removes most of the direct divine intervention, changes the personalities and functions of several mythological figures, imports material from other ancient works, reimagines major monsters, and creates a completely different ending. But it is also a very entertaining film. The Cyclops is one of the best mythological creatures I've seen on screen in a long time. The pacing held my attention for almost 3 hours, and the movie captures the exhaustion, scale, danger, and emotional weight of an impossibly long journey home, even when it changes the ancient material used to tell it. As Homer's Odyssey, it is inconsistent, heavily modernized, and occasionally unrecognizable. As Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, it's one of his better films. 8 out of 10. And that's it for today's video. I'd love to hear what all of you thought about the movie. What did you like? What did you dislike? Let me know down in the comment section below, and as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more Mythology Explained. See you in the next one.